one of the most influential men in the history of Mexico, the archetype of a military leader who, with an iron fist, consolidated and modernized the Mexican national state. After half a century of wars, social upheaval, and instability, Porfirio Díaz managed to conquer power and pacify, for more than 30 years, one of the largest and most complex nations in America. Some consider him the peacemaker who brought economic development and order to Mexico, while others see him as a great oppressor, as the dark character of Mexican history. One of the most unique lives of his time. His life is also the story of the different decisive stages that marked Mexico, and today we are going to know it. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking from the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to like this video, to leave your comments, to share it with your acquaintances, and support us on our Patreon, which you can find below in the comments. On the night of September 15th, 1830, José de la Cruz Porfirio Díaz Mori was born in the city of Oaxaca. His deeply Catholic father was a Spanish Creole, while his mother was a Mixtec indigenous woman. At the age of 13, his godfather uncle, who was a priest, convinced him to pursue a religious career, joining the Conciliar Seminary College of Oaxaca. Porfirio's first warrior tendencies surfaced in 1846, when the United States invasion of Mexico broke out. And Porfirio enlists, along with other seminarians in the National Guard. However, he did not get to participate in direct combat. At that time, the political landscape of Mexico was divided between liberals and conservatives, which were the two political factions that had consolidated after Mexico's independence from the Spanish Empire. For his good performance in Latin while he was in the seminary, Porfirio meets a respected liberal politician from the area, who, in addition to taking him to a political event of Benito Juárez, who at that time was governor of Oaxaca and the future president of Mexico, convinces Porfirio to abandon the priesthood in 1849 to begin studies in law at the Institute of Sciences and Arts of Oaxaca, a liberal court institute. Porfirio attended classes with distinguished professors, including Benito Juárez, who also incorporated him into his political group. Despite his excellent performance, Porfirio did not obtain a law degree, because in 1854, just as he was preparing for his professional exam that would give him the title, the Ayutla Revolution broke out, a revolution that made the president of Mexico order the closure of the institute where he was studying. The Ayutla Revolution. It was an uprising of liberals and other groups against the government, with the slogan of "No to re-election" to thus depose the president, Santa Anna, who was holding the presidency of Mexico for the 6th time. Several professors from the institute linked to politics were imprisoned in that revolution. In this way, the thirst for action embraced Porfirio Díaz, who joined the liberal uprising against President Santa Anna, and he gave his first display of war skills by forming a guerrilla group that confronted the federal forces in Teotongo. At this moment, Porfirio officially begins what would be an extensive military career, and his leadership abilities began to stand out immediately. In August of 1855, Santa Anna resigns from the presidency. Juan Alvarez, who had led the revolution, becomes the new president of Mexico, and Porfirio Díaz is appointed as the political chief of the Ixtlan district, located in Oaxaca, where Porfirio organizes the first military guard in the history of that district. Although the uprising had ended, everyone knew that a new war was about to come. And indeed, when the Mexican liberals established a new constitution in 1857, the conservatives started an armed rebellion against the liberal government. Porfirio and his guard participated in capturing the city of Oaxaca and other battles against conservative rebel forces. After years of struggle, the new liberal president, Ignacio Comonfort, conferred upon Porfirio Díaz at his 29 years of age the prominent position of governor and military commander of the Tuxtepec district. In the following years, and despite being at a disadvantage, Porfirio manages to defeat the conservatives in several small confrontations that earned him a promotion to lieutenant colonel. During these years, a French traveler describes Porfirio as someone, quote, tall, well-made, of notable distinction, his face of great nobility, pleasantly tanned, seem to me to reveal the most perfect features of the ancient Mexican aristocracy." End quote. This conflict, which began in 1857 between conservatives and liberals, was named the Reform War or the 3 Years' War. During this period, Porfirio fought in other battles and was conferred the rank of lieutenant general. Finally, the liberals achieved the definitive victory in the Battle of Calpulalpan in 1861. That same year, Diaz was nominated for federal deputy and obtained a seat for Oaxaca in the Congress of the Union. One of the strangest and most embarrassing episodes of his life occurred when, trying to deliver his first speech in Congress, Diaz began to stutter until he was mute. And finally, he broke into tears, leaving the room in front of the astonished gaze of those present. Another striking fact is that during these years, Porfirio joined the Freemasonry, in which he was present for a large part of his life. However, the defeat of the conservatives did not in any way mean the arrival of peace for Mexico. Although Porfirio Diaz had already shown military skills, it was during the Second French intervention in Mexico that he had his most praised performance. After the Mexican government, led by Benito Juarez, announced the suspension of foreign debt payments due to the bankruptcy of the national treasury. In early December 1861, armed Spanish, French, and English forces arrived in Mexico. An agreement is reached with Spain and England, but France refuses to leave the territory. In March 1862, it advances into the country's interior with over 5,000 soldiers. President Benito Juarez orders to confront the French forces in Puebla, and on the 5th of May, Porfirio and other military personnel fight in the historic Battle of Puebla, where they managed to defeat the French and push them back. Porfirio played a decisive role in the battle, and the general in charge would publicly praise his work, quote, "dedication and bravery." In turn, it seemed that the French threat had been neutralized. But at the beginning of the following year, the French Emperor Napoleon III sent over 30,000 soldiers to Mexico, for he had the firm intention of establishing a new French imperial presence on American soil. In March of that same year, the French besieged the city of Puebla, where Porfirio was for his outstanding participation in the defense of the Santa Ynez convent. Porfirio Diaz was promoted to effective brigade general. But after 2 months of siege, the Mexican army, greatly outnumbered, had to surrender the city of Puebla. Porfirio was in the capital, Mexico City, in 1863. President Juarez offered him to be the Secretary or Minister of War and Navy, but Diaz did not accept, as he considered himself too young for that position. Instead, Juarez offers him to command his own division in the war against the French. So with 30,000 soldiers under his command during all those months, he develops a guerrilla war against the French that prevents them from taking over that key state. On the 14th of October of the same year, Porfirio is promoted to division general in command of the Eastern Army, with jurisdiction over Oaxaca, Veracruz, Chiapas, Tabasco, Campeche, and Yucatan. The political situation was chaotic, and the French and Mexican conservatives formed an alliance. By 1864, a group of Mexican conservative clergymen and politicians, they offered the crown to Archduke Maximilian of Habsburg to restore the Mexican Empire, which marked the beginning of the Second Mexican Empire. It is called the Second Empire because after the independence of Mexico, the independence fighters did not form a republic, but a monarchical empire that lasted from 1821 to 1823. Now in 1864, the conservatives, with the support of the French and Maximilian of Habsburg, were trying to revive a second empire of this nature. So, in fact, two parallel governments were formed in Mexico, the conservative monarchist and the liberal republican, led by Benito Juarez. The new emperor, Maximilian of Habsburg, sent more than one Mexican emissary to propose to Porfirio to abandon the republicans and join the empire, keeping his troops. Porfirio's response was emphatic, open quotes, "Neither for me nor for the distinguished staff of the army, nor for all the peoples of this extensive part of the republic, can one believe in the possibility of a settlement with the foreign invasion. Resolved as we are to fight without truce, to conquer or die in the demand to bequeath to the generation that replaces us the same free and sovereign republic that we inherited from our parents." End quote. After losing the city of Oaxaca to 9,000 French soldiers and 1,000 Mexican conservative soldiers and escaping from prison, Porfirio Díaz heads south and continues to recruit troops, being reinstated by Benito Juárez as the head of the Eastern Army. Meanwhile, the conservatives and French were gaining ground, but the upcoming events would be of special importance. During 1866, Díaz continues to carry out some military operations to harass the French and their followers, and he manages to recover Oaxaca once again. Then, after several weeks of combat in which he performed extraordinarily, the liberals regained the city of Puebla. In the famous Battle of April 2nd, for which Porfirio was called the Hero of April 2nd. Parallel to all this, a final blessing of grace fell upon the Mexican Republicans when Napoleon III, due to internal pressures and the proximity of the Franco-Prussian War, orders the withdrawal of French troops from Mexico. This marked the beginning of the end of the Second Mexican Empire. While the liberal soldiers were besieging Mexico City in April, they also took the city of Querétaro, where they captured Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg. Despite the plea for clemency from numerous figures, such as the famous French writer Victor Hugo, the emperor was shot by the Republicans. Only the country's capital remained in the hands of the conservatives, which was taken without much bloodshed by the Republicans. The 21st of June. At the end of the day, Porfirio submitted his resignation as chief of the Eastern Army, as he believed there was no longer any reason to continue in command. The 15th of July. Porfirio Díaz receives President Benito Juárez in the capital of the Republic, who personally raises the Mexican flag at the National Palace and publicly acknowledges Porfirio Díaz. In his speech, the war had ended. After these years of intense struggles against conservatives and invaders, Porfirio Díaz had gained throughout the country the prestige of a heroic and honorable military man. He also showed good skills as an administrator, as the military campaign under his charge ended with a notable financial surplus. Another important event during that same year was when on May 15th, Porfirio Díaz married his niece, Delfina Ortega Díaz, daughter of his sister Manuela, for which he had to mediate with President Juárez, as this was prohibited by law. With her, he had 7 children, but only 2 survived. With the triumph of the liberals in 1867, the period known in Mexico as the Restored Republic began, which would last until the arrival of Porfirio Díaz to power. 9 years later, Benito Juárez noticed the great leadership and political ambition of Porfirio Díaz, so the relationship between them began to deteriorate. In 1867, Díaz participated in the presidential elections against Juárez, but was defeated by a landslide. Porfirio resigned from the army and went to his gifted estate in Oaxaca, a reward from the state government for his war service. He lived there with his wife, Delfina, harvesting sugarcane and melting cannons and armaments to sell. At the same time, he maintained contact with his numerous military supporters, who saw in him a hope to get out of the anarchy in which they still lived. Mexico, with a weak state and a multitude of regional leaders. In 1871, Juárez won the elections again against Porfirio Díaz and against a third candidate named Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada. But this time, Díaz was not willing to return to the tranquility of his estate. So on November 7th of the same year, followed by his brother Felix, who resigned from the government of Oaxaca, he proclaimed the revolution with the so-called Plan de la Novia, in which he did not recognize the government of Juárez on the grounds that Juárez's re-election violated the letter of the Constitution consecrated in 1857. With the flag of restoring institutionalism, a new revolution began, full of armed confrontations. The ceasefire took place on July 18th of 1872, when President Juárez passed away, which made the proclamation of no re-election meaningless. Porfirio Díaz presented his candidacy for new elections, but this time Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada was the winner. Porfirio decides once again to retire to Oaxaca, where he sold his estate and moved to live in Veracruz. There he devoted himself to sugar farming and carpentry, even inventing a rocking chair with a built-in fan. But his political ambitions were more alive than ever, and a series of policies carried out by President Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, such as the expulsion of religious orders, The dismissal of local governors and the increase in taxes made Porfirio's supporters gain more and more followers. When President Lerdo announced his candidacy for re-election in 1876, arguing that the Constitution was being violated, Porfirio proclaims the Tuxtepec Revolution, accompanied by various military personnel from the country, along with support, in addition to the Catholic Church, which had been greatly affected by liberal governments. This revolution would be the last war of the 19th century in Mexico. Porfirio's revolution was gaining ground among victories and defeats. Porfirio manages to reorganize troops and seek more funding inside and outside the country. Upon his return, along with the new rebel forces, he defeats the government troops and enters victorious into Mexico City. In November of that same year, being acclaimed by a crowd shouting the leader of democracy, he immediately declared himself as the provisional president of the Mexican Republic. He eventually appoints a new provisional president to call for extraordinary elections, which Porfirio won as the sole candidate. Finally, the young man, who 23 years ago had joined the revolution of the liberals in solidarity with his institute professors, he was proclaimed by the Union Congress as the constitutional president of Mexico on May 5th of 1877. After tumultuous years of civil wars, riots, revolutions, and foreign interventions, the motto of Porfirio Díaz's presidency would be order and progress, a period also imbued with the positivist ideas in vogue in America. From the Ayutla Revolution, where he began as a military man, through the war between liberals and conservatives, the French invasion, and the successive revolutions. Finally, Porfirio established what would be the longest and most transformative government in contemporary Mexican history. Mexican historian Javier Garcia Diego describes Porfirio's vision in this way. His biography shows that when he took power, he understood the high cost Mexico paid for living amid uprisings, proclamations, and rebellions. That's why he strived to impose peace in the country. That's right, it was a forced peace. His own political experience led him to despise electoral processes and legislative parliamentary institutions. Finally, he recognized short and weak presidencies as fatal. End quote. So Porfirio established as a top priority the iron-fisted consolidation of public peace as a prerequisite and indispensable for any other progress of the country. In addition to the regional chieftainships and local leaders consolidated since independence, Mexico's peace had a serious crime problem, with bands of thieves everywhere. The first thing that was done for this was to centralize all the armed groups in the country into the federal army and reduce their presence in the regional localities. This meant the reorganization and professionalization of the armed forces. Similarly, Porfirio appointed trusted military chiefs as governors and bought out businesses and interests of those who were not close to him. Similarly, a massive disarmament campaign was implemented, and many military personnel were transferred to the famous rural corps that were created as Porfirio's armed wing. In the field against criminals and opponents to the regime, the subordination of all the country's chieftains to the federal government paved the way for the institutionalization and modernization of the Mexican state. During his first years in government, multiple rebellions were violently suppressed and hundreds of criminals were executed. Porfirio managed to reconcile interests that were always opposed for the sake of national stability. His first government was highly inclusive, with liberals, Lerdistas, and even monarchists in his cabinet. The pacification was complemented by a harsh repression of those who threatened stability. From the beginning to the end of his term, hundreds of opponents were imprisoned, exiled, or disappeared. As Diaz himself would declare years later, he thought that, open quotes, to avoid the spilling of torrents of blood, it was necessary to spill a little. The stability achieved allowed the Mexican government to initiate an ambitious plan for economic modernization and industrial development of the country. In addition to seeking international recognition, mainly from Western powers such as Germany, France, England, and the United States, in order to attract foreign capital that was considered indispensable for the economic development of a country that was torn apart by wars, the United States initially declined to negotiate with Mexico, but relations were later restored. Porfirio was very aware of the dangers of the colonial expansionism of the time, especially in the United States, not only with its territorial expansionism, but now also economic. Where would then come the famous phrase of Porfirio that said, "Mexico's so far from heaven and so close to the United States"? Under President Porfirio Díaz, foreign investment and industrialization were encouraged. Important communication routes and roads were developed. More than 20,000 kilometers of railway tracks were built, and a telegraphic network was created throughout Mexico. Similarly, hundreds of new glass, steel, cement, fabric, footwear, and beer factories were built in different cities. New banks were also established, like the first government credit institution. In the countryside, the exploitation of sugarcane and other foods previously worked by hand was industrialized. Through a policy of attracting European immigrants and granting lands to New Mexican landowners or foreign capitals, this generated resistance from various indigenous and rural communities who were violently displaced or crushed by the Mexican government. Mining and oil exploitation also grew substantially and modernized with the help of foreign capital. By 1910, Mexico was the most industrialized nation in Latin America, in addition to being an exporter of raw materials, oil, and food, and an importer of manufactured goods. Díaz was able to weave an alliance between the local oligarchy, foreign capital, and the military to establish an orderly government. In this way, he unified those who were previously political enemies under the shelter of an emerging business class. During the government of Porfirio, architectural works were also built that are unparalleled in the history of Mexico, such as the Palace of Fine Arts, the Chapultepec Forest, the Angel of Independence, the National Museum of Art, and many other works. Upon completing his first term of government in 1880, Díaz supports his compadre Manuel González as the next elected president, who served as Minister of War and had been loyal to Porfirio for decades. During the presidency, Manuel González Díaz serves as Minister of Development and was the figure who really held power. During these years, Porfirio visited the United States, where he deepened his relationships with high members of politics, business, and the American military world. Now, in 1884, after several accusations of corruption in the government of Manuel González, Porfirio Díaz wins the elections and takes control of the country again, uninterruptedly, until 1911. Once installed in office again, various reforms to the Constitution allowed him to be re-elected indefinitely. Likewise, he managed to have the Congress made up of a large majority of Porfiristas who aged in Congress, rotating between the positions of deputies and senators. The truth is that this new political configuration was achieved with the support of the majority of the country. For the internal sectors of Mexico, the most important thing was peace and national and material reconstruction. And about this, it is very important to mention. After many decades of confrontations between the Catholic Church and liberal governments, Porfirio initiated a policy of reconciliation between the state and the Church to consider it necessary for national unity. Therefore, contrary to many of the old reforms, he allowed the Catholic clergy to recover their properties and re-establish congregations and monasteries from which they had been stripped. Unquestionably, in a new Mexico they were creating. Another very important aspect of the Porfiriato was that public finances, previously very disorganized, were cleaned up, and national credit was improved, gaining great confidence abroad. The public treasury, usually bankrupt, became superaviary from 1894. In 15 years of government, Porfirio announced to the country that he had finished paying the Mexican debt to the United States, which had been weighing on the country for a long time. This period of peace and economic development also allowed public education, painting, sculpture, literature, and music to flourish in Mexico during the Porfiriato, as had not happened since the colonial era. Cultural and scientific activities were promoted from the government, as it was considered that the country's scientific advancement was paramount for its overall progress. Schools for teachers, libraries, institutes, scientific societies, and cultural associations were founded. Freedom of the press was very limited, especially for leftist media. Although there were still publications against the government, just like many others of an officialist nature. As a corollary to economic advances and the pacification of the country, poverty, unemployment, poor working conditions, and health conditions were far from being completely eradicated. Social inequality was marked in a world that was moving towards a mass and consumer society. In turn, in the previous years, at the end of his government, Diaz sought to curb what he considered an excessive influence of American investors in Mexico. He sought to neutralize this through nationalizations and, above all, by attracting French, Japanese, and English capital. This aroused the opposition of powerful American groups, which, added to a growing middle class in Mexico, demanded political and civil liberties. And coupled with an emerging movement of peasants and Indians, stripped of their old jobs, they were laying the groundwork for the overthrow of Porfirio Díaz. In 1907, Porfirio Díaz had already been in power for 30 years, and the challenges to his regime were hardening, which was also going through a temporary economic recession. Figures like the businessman Francisco Madero ventured into politics, and the first dissident Porfirians emerged. During these decades, there were rebellions in the countryside, labor strikes, and public demonstrations that were successfully repressed, but they were on the rise. In 1908, Porfirio Díaz expressed his determination to leave power, as well as his approval of the formation of political parties. In that interview, as a positivist, he expressed that the country was ready for democracy. This statement generated a great deal of agitation among Porfirian politicians and opposition politicians, who began forming new political groups. However, Díaz did not fulfill his promise and was re-elected for the presidential term from 1910 to 1916. Given this situation, on October 5, 1910, from exile in the United States, Francisco Madero, as a representative of the opposition, proclaimed the Plan of San Luis, a document that called on the Mexican people to take up arms. After 30 years of peace, the armed conflict known as the Mexican Revolution began. Various sectors against Porfirio were led by regional leaders, among whom Emiliano Zapata in the south of the country and Pascual Orozco and Francisco Pancho Villa in the north stood out. The insurrection was growing. In April of 1911, most of the country already had revolutionary groups rising in its territory, which were gaining spaces and taking over towns. Porfirio attempts to negotiate with the opposition and offers reforms based on their demands, but this fails to benefit the Porfirian regime. On May 10th, Pascual Orozco's revolutionaries seized the military square of Ciudad Juárez. This was a deadly blow to Díaz's government. In that same month, the revolutionaries enter various parts of the country, while the government army chose to retreat to the capital and surrounding areas. For its part, the United States moved its troops to the border of Mexico, awaiting a possible intervention in order to protect its interest in that country. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, Porfirio was suffering from a gum disease, physical exhaustion, and deafness. Faced with the defeat of his forces in Ciudad Juárez, the growing unrest, and the possibility of a North American intervention, Porfirio Díaz begins to plan his resignation in a way that would not imply the collapse of his regime. After various negotiations with the opposition, on the night of May 23rd, Porfirio Díaz begins to draft his resignation. And on May 25th, the Chamber of Deputies, amidst a demonstration, unanimously approves the president's resignation. In this way, Porfirio Díaz was leaving power after more than 30 years of rule. But the federal army, the Porfirian regime, remained unshaken, and no pretexts were given for foreign intervention. What would come next with the arrival of the revolutionaries to power is another story for another video. Thus ended the mandate of Porfirio Díaz, the man who ruled the vast Mexican country for the longest time and who transformed it forever. After this, Porfirio Díaz and his family went into exile in Paris, France, where he met with French soldiers he had fought alongside. 50 years ago, General Gustave Léon Niox accompanied him to the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte, whom Porfirio admired Niox. Suddenly, he pulled out the sword that Bonaparte used in 1805 during the Battle of Austerlitz and placed it in Díaz's hands, who, shocked, said he did not deserve to have it in his hands. To which the Frenchman replied that it had never been in better hands. After several years traveling around Europe, his health begins to deteriorate until he dies in 1915 at the age of 84. The life of Porfirio Díaz is also a faithful representation of the life of Mexico. From the Ayutla Revolution, where Díaz started as a military man, to the Reform War between liberals and conservatives, up to the war against the French invasion and the subsequent Noria Revolution and Tuxtepec Revolution, which finally won power for Porfirianism. During all this time, Mexican life was taking place amidst constant armed and political convulsions. For Mexicans, peace was an unknown good, until Porfirio assumed the presidency and led one of the longest and most transformative regimes that the American continent has ever experienced. A government that, according to historian Elisa Speckman, open quotes, would mean advances in the consolidation of the nation-state and would transform the economy, society, and Mexican culture. Despite its legacy of political vices and economic and social inequality,